I want to officially welcome everyone to our discussion today. I'm so thrilled to be able to engage in this discussion with such an esteemed panel of colleagues. Today, we're really going to spend our time talking about the science of reading and English learners. And we're going to just engage in a very authentic conversation that we want to invite you into through your questions in the Q&A. So before we get started, we want to know who you are. So I'm going to launch a little poll. There it is. If you'll let us know, what's your role in education? Are elementary, middle, high? Are you a parent, special education, or interventionist? Go ahead and give us your who you are, and then we'll show everybody who's with us today. We're almost at 70% of folks letting us know who they are. All right, I'm going to end the poll. And here are the results. That's who's with us today. Fascinating. So elementary teachers, we have one lone middle school teacher. Welcome. We are so grateful you're here, as well as administrators, coaches, and a whole lot of something else. We got a couple parents with us as well. I know that many of us span those roles, both a teacher and a parent. So grateful that you're here. Well, without further ado, I am going to go ahead and shift us into introducing our panel. And Elsa, do you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to have you. I'm Elsa Cárdenas-Hagan, and I come to you from Brownsville, Texas, right on the tip of Texas and Mexico. I'm a speech and language pathologist and a certified academic language therapist, and have had the opportunity to dedicate myself to really trying to look at the language and literacy needs of bilingual students, specifically Spanish-speaking bilingual students, and also looking at interventions and those early skills that had the opportunity to design some assessments and really work diligently on national research projects for now 25 years. And one of those studies with Claude Goldenberg, who's just so awesome, and have met Linda Diamond along the way. So we're so excited to have you here and get ready for this great discussion, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Elsa. Linda, I'll turn it to you.
Yes, I'm delighted to be here and welcome all of you who I know could be doing other things, but you choose to be here with us. That's terrific. And I always enjoy interacting with Claude and with Elsa. And I really come from the practitioner side. I founded and was the past president of the Consortium on Reaching Excellence in Education, CORE, and focused on professional learning and professional development for over 27 years. And then am also the author of the Teaching Reading Sourcebook, which I just found out is the #1 textbook used in teacher preparation programs that are aligned to the science of reading. So I was thrilled to learn that just about a week ago. And now I am just spending my time stirring up trouble and working quite a bit with teacher preparation with the NCTQ as we are reviewing teacher prep syllabi to make sure that higher ed actually is preparing future teachers.
Thanks, Linda. It's such important work. Turn it over to you, Claude.
Thanks, Marissa. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many names in the chat box from all over the country and the world. I saw at least one from Lima, Peru. So welcome, everyone. Si tiene preguntas en español, nos puede hacer a Elsa y a mí, but otherwise we can stick to English. I'm delighted to be with the three of you. Marissa, thank you so much for the invitation. It was great to meet you and great to be with my friends and colleagues, Linda and Elsa. I started my education career as a middle school teacher, teaching reading and history, and Was very poorly prepared, unfortunately. I was maybe a poster child for unprepared teachers who are put in assignments that they really just don't have the adequate background for. So I escaped to the university to study some more and try to learn why things happen as they do in child development and education. Then I went back and I taught first grade for a few years. And then I retreated back to university because teaching first grade was so darn hard. So I've been sort of in and out of classrooms and university settings for the past 30, 40 years. I was at Cal State Long Beach. Most recently, I was at Stanford, and I retired a few years ago so I could do fun stuff like this. So thank you again, Marissa, for the invitation, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you guys so much. And first grade teachers unite. I was a former first grade teacher for the longest part of my career. And I am Dr. Marisa Ramirez-Stuckey. I am the Senior Director of Research and Engagement here at the Center for the Collaborative Classroom. And I don't think I can express how excited I am to join this conversation today. And I'm so grateful that you guys have come together to have this conversation with us. I think what the audience can see from the get-go is that all y'all are friends, as we say here in the South, and I'm so grateful for that, which means that we're going to have a really rich conversation. So I'm going to kick us off with a question to just get us started, but really we're just going to chat. And if you want to join this chat, I want to encourage you to add your questions into the Q&A, and we'll bring those in as they pertain to the conversation. So, you know, we're talking a lot about the science of reading, and there's so much richness within that body of work. I want to narrow us just for the very beginning as we think about foundational skills instruction. And when we think about how that foundational skills instruction meets our English learners, what's really essential for teachers to plan for and consider around that aspect of the science of reading? So Elsa, will you just start us off?
I sure will. Thank you so much. Well, one of the things, of course, you have to understand, I come from a language background, but language is everything. And I'm sure my colleagues here will agree. But what is essential when we think about English learners and we have to think about the context that they're in. Are they in a dual language setting? Are they in a 50-50 model? Are they in a model that it's just primarily English as a second language? As we look at that context and think about that and think about literacy, we have to remember that language is the foundation for reading. Language, right? It's a natural process, and reading is language-based. And so as we work with our English learners, it's essential for us to be considering intentionally and authentically, how am I going to help them in their oral language proficiency skills, whether that's in one language or two or more languages. And as we think about the foundational skills, how can we integrate those foundational skills? In other words, when we think about, when we go in classrooms, we don't want to see, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this next thing, and it's all kind of in segments. What we want to see is that integration, that foundation of literacy does begin. I have the ability to process and manipulate those sounds and link those to letters so that I can decode and read. But our ultimate goal of reading is to be able to comprehend. So as I'm working on these skills, I have to be working and improving the language skills in intentional ways, not incidental.
Yeah, I think we all agree with that. I mean, language is the foundation of reading, but I'd like to make a distinction and see if Linda and Elsa agree with this. I mean, feel free not to, of course, but different aspects of language are really important at different phases and stages of reading development for second language learners. So if students are in a second language, learning to read in the language they are simultaneously learning to understand, then first of all, you need to understand kind of like the dual challenge, the double-barreled challenge of learning to read and developing in your literacy in a language you are simultaneously learning to speak and understand. So that's the first thing. It's a double-barreled challenge for students and for teachers, of course. Now, what happens, I think, is that when students are second language learners are in an English-only literacy instructional environment, what's particularly critical for acquiring those literacy skills is that they understand, they're helped to understand, they're taught to understand the words and the text that are being used to teach them to read. Now we know from foundational research, both in second language and first language, is that as the neuroscientists like to say, the binding of the orthography, the spelling system, with the phonology, the sound system, is fundamental, is foundational. Now, kids who already know the language, they can bring an already existing knowledge of semantics, vocabulary, syntax, all the ways that language means beyond just the sounds. They can bring that because they already know it. But for second language learners, and there's some really quite fascinating brain studies that I think demonstrate this pretty conclusively, as well as classroom studies that kind of nail it down behaviorally and instructionally, that you have to support the English learners by making sure they understand the words they're being taught to read. So words like run, stop, I, me, and so forth, that language speakers, I mean, you don't have to teach those. I mean, unless there's some kind of aphasia or some real problem, kids who are learning to read understand those words if they're native or proficient in the language. Kids who are not proficient in the language, you have to make sure they understand those words, because once they decode them, which is how we want them to read it, they have to be able to confirm that they're reading the right thing, the right word, through the meaning, syntax, and comprehension. You don't recognize words by looking at pictures and looking at context, but you confirm it once you can decode it. And it's a very important part of the process. So those words that they're being taught to read, they need to understand what those words are and what the text means. That's really important for reading. Now, there's a larger language learning agenda for sure, but specifically for learning to read in the beginning stages, that's what you need to focus on during reading time.
Yeah, and I would add, I completely agree. I think that, and this goes back to what Elsa said about integrating instead of necessarily having the separate silos. And I think, Claude, you just said it as well. We need to look at the words that they're also reading and make sure that they have those meanings. So even at the level of, for example, a sounding out or blending exercise, where kids are reading a set of words and sounding them out, I think it's going to be important to be mindful that some of those words that they're sounding out in a phonics lesson may not be known to these young children and anyone at a beginning stage. And so the meanings, even if it's short and fast, when you're doing a phonics focused lesson, you still need to be attentive to making sure that the kids know what those words they're decoding actually mean.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, Linda and Claude, that I think as you're speaking, you're talking about, as we read, the ultimate goal, we say, is to understand. And for the English learner, depending where they are, we are always having to check, are they understanding? But one of the things, and also is one of the things I do want to point out, and that we have found that even words like, a simple word, Claude, you just use that simple word, run. And they, of course they, probably know what that means, but they don't know that word in depth. I've come up with that example with 45 definitions of that word run, run a temperature, run amok, run for office, right? And so it's really getting to explore, the depth of which they know and their experiences around those words. But you're right. As they're reading, we need to be always checking for that understanding. And what I like to do is really think about, I want to make sure that you really understand the phonological features of these words, the meaning features of these words, how we use these words. Claude mentioned, the syntax, but we want to create those opportunities to read, understand, and use.
Marissa, I've been looking at the chat. I mean, one thing that always comes up, and I'm glad it was brought up by I think, Holly, that the question is, are there any programs that actually enact what we're talking about? I mean, maybe some people disagree, but so far no one's disagreeing. They're saying, well, do we just have to make up the curriculum, or are there some programs that actually enact this? I don't know of any personally. Elsa?
I have a program. I didn't want to say,
yes,
because I'm not here to. Yes. So in the year 2000, I developed a program that would specifically look at how you teach English reading to English learners, and and it's all for Spanish speaking English learners, and how you use their knowledge, what Claude is saying about, they already have this knowledge, they know, like for example, cognates, they know words that are the same, and that we can also use the morphemes or those word parts as meaningful meaning units. But we take advantage of what they already know. We don't need to teach them what they already know. We need to teach them the connections.
Is
And
it a published
so,
program? I'm sorry to interrupt.
yeah. So it is,
Can we put it, can
So
we
I
put
didn't
on the
want to
chat?
say, because I'm not here
No,
to
go.
sell
No,
that.
absolutely. It'd be a
But
huge service.
instead of selling that, I did write a book on the subject matter
I know
called
that, yeah.
Literacy Foundations, for English learners. But for 15 years, I talked about the things. But unless you give and Linda will agree with me, unless you give a framework, here's some lessons. This is how it looks. Now take off from there,
Yes.
apply it to what you're doing. But here's how you get started, because just through all this professional development, you do that work, and then you support teachers, and you go in, you're like, okay, they're not getting it quite. So let's put together like a framework, and let me help you design these lessons. And by knowing that kind of framework and how this all can be integrated, you're consent free to do great work.
Great. And we're going to put that link in the chat, right? Or somewhere.
I'm not here to
Listen, I mean, I'm not getting any kickback here. Just let's be clear.
I think one of the things that's coming out of this conversation already from the beginning is really around the tendency to segment. If I were to, draw forth Dr. Scarborough's reading rope, right? There's often a tendency to segment. Here's this part of the rope. Here's that part of the rope. Let's do this part before that part. Sometimes that's the way those come across. What I'm really hearing here is that the integration is especially essential for our English learners. So I'd love to kind of keep us moving in that direction around when we think about the language comprehension aspects of what's necessary to develop these students into more sophisticated readers, writers, thinkers. How do we think about those essential instructional components, and how do they support and build on what they're learning as a part of those foundational skills? Linda, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Okay, so, and I know Claude and Elsa will talk about this as well, but we talk often about what Isabel Beck refers to as tier 2 words, and for sure we have to work on those general academic words. Of course, we're going to also have to work on discipline-specific academic words, because the kids are learning content as well. But I want to go back to something Elsa said, because there's basic function words like run, or sometimes even as basic as on, put this on the chair, that we have to be sure that the kids learn as well. And I think it's very important to be sure that we're building this vocabulary and then applying it in context, so kids can see the vocabulary in action. They can learn, and it goes back to that depth of knowledge. And Claude remembers when we were working on one of the US DOE grant, where we were developing an actual curriculum for middle school students, that issue of depth of knowledge and understanding the words deeply was a really important one, because they're nuanced in different texts. And so helping these kids learn that. And I think I want to go back to something Claude said earlier, and that is, and you, Marissa, brought this up, that division between language comprehension and word recognition, it was never meant to be separate. It wasn't one first, but they interact and they build on each other. I think Claude has a very nice visual that shows how those can meet. Beyond the visual, the metaphor of the reading rope, but that you've got to, while you're working on vocabulary and you're working on all types of vocabulary, spoken, written, basic, academic, discipline, you have to also at the same time be working on expanding word recognition, because now you're going to get into morphological issues when you're dealing with vocabulary, prefix, suffix, building on the use of cognates with Spanish speakers and where it's appropriate. And then I just want to put a plug in for making use of primary language when it's also appropriate to do, and not, there are some places that still say don't use primary language. Well, that makes no sense at all. So.
Well, I want to pick up on the integrating thing, because I think this is one of the challenges that we face as teachers. Researchers can sort of sidestep these challenges and just choose the questions they want to address. Well, teachers don't have that luxury. And while it's true that these things need to integrate, there is a sense in which they are distinct from each other and need to be taught distinctly, but with an eye towards integration. So Marissa, I don't know if you want to toss up my road metaphor.
Here we go.
Which actually, I think Hollis Scarborough's rope conception is, just a brilliant conceptualization. And, this, really borrows a lot from that. I just kind of tried to streamline it or simplify it. And, we can think of literacy as starting on two paths that are kind of start at different places, because this is figurative, but literally they start at different places in the brain. Things begin in different places and then have to integrate. So you can imagine these two paths that eventually have to converge. If you have the next slide, yeah, and they converge. See that thing at the that was okay. Well, that's all right.
Go back. Hold on.
That's all right. No, the thing at the end right there, I wanted to show that. See that thing at the end? That's the house of literacy, right? That's where we're headed, to the house of literacy. So now when we get a little more figurative instead of literal, maybe more literal, and the destination is literacy. It starts in different places. So you want to think about, at least I think about, go on to the next one, Marissa, that there's the house of literacy, go on to the next one. And what are the pathways to literacy? Well, there are two sets, right? There's the foundational skills and the communication focus, right? Foundational skills might call the road to the code. Phonology, letters and sounds, phonics, and so forth. Communication is language, knowledge, experience, comprehension. And they begin sort of in different places, but eventually they have to converge for literacy. And one of the places they converge, I think the next one is at fluency. Fluency is fundamental to bringing these together. And it's not just fluency at the point of reading text. You have to work on fluency from the point of understanding, recognizing letters and associating letters and sounds and beginning decoding. You have to work on fluency all the time in order for the communication, the language, the experience, the meaning to converge and go all the way to literacy. So you have this convergence for darn sure, that's the goal, but you have to think about these in rather different ways instructionally, because there are instructional models that work differently for different things. Learning to decode is basically a memorization process. There's nothing inherently meaningful about an A, a B, or a C, or a D, but teaching readers, learners to link up those letters with the sounds and the words they produce, going, as Louisa Moat says, from speech to print and print to speech. That is where the magic happens. They have to converge, but you have to be aware of the fact that they begin in different places, and we have to work towards making them converge. And it's a bit of a delicate dance for teachers, because I don't know of any roadmap that gives you some algorithm telling you, now you do this, now you do that. There's some general guidelines, but a lot of it comes from being in the classroom, having the timing and the touch when kids need more phonics-oriented coding work, when they have more comprehension. There's actually some work developing now that we haven't talked about that the late Carol Conrad developed that allows teachers to get a better handle on when in beginning reading kids need more code work and when they need more comprehension work. I think that'd be a very useful tool that I don't think is coming to general use yet, but I predict that when people become aware of it and it's kind of pushed out, it'll be really helpful in helping people get the timing and the sequencing right, and kids get what they need along those two roads and help them converge, which is, as Elsa said at the beginning, what we're aiming for.
And
Yeah,
I'd like
I
to
would
just
just
say,
add,
go ahead.
well, I just want to
Go ahead.
clarify that when we talk about this integration, it doesn't mean incidental teaching. It doesn't mean you suddenly teach a phonics lesson in the context, okay, but you're going to be aware of the applications and how you bring things together, but you're going to be explicitly and systematically teaching that mapping of sound to print and getting at the full orthographic mapping. But then we have to constantly be aware of the application and what we need to do to make that seamless.
100%.
And I'd like to just add, from what Claude and Linda are saying, we're really talking about really being diagnostic and prescriptive. Claude is describing that there's now, great work out there that will help guide you along to be diagnostic and prescriptive, but really understanding that child and so you can differentiate your instruction. That's what you're talking about, Claude, that, here is this student, what are they capable of? And how am I going to know what they're capable of? Well, I've got to be there working with them as they're reading and understanding. But one of the things that is so important as they're reading and we're trying to get understanding, and you are the person there observing, taking note, that's your moment for intervention and to really learn, okay, that pattern, that error pattern that I just saw is an opportunity for teaching and learning. And I'm going to meet them right at that point of need. So what do those error patterns look like? And many of those patterns are typical. These overgeneralization patterns of Claude talked about bringing all this knowledge that I already have from my native language to the second language. There are very typical patterns that we see. And instead of worrying about them, I tell the students, good for you. You're thinking, you made a connection. But in this language, it's like this. And it's because of that. So now so that there's a point of overgeneralization. And we see that in those language structures. We see it as they're learning reading. We see it as in their spelling, and we see it in their writing. And can we take that and look at that and use those errors as opportunities to inform instruction?
Such an important point, and it's coming up a lot in the chat around the idea of the primary language, leveraging that knowledge. And, we've talked a lot today about Spanish speakers. We know they're the fastest growing population. Many times folks when we think about English learners, we often think Spanish first, but we also know that there are so many languages that are now coming into our country, and all of these children need to be instructed. So even, I have a fairly good foundation of Spanish, but by gosh, I'm not going to be able to help my Somali child who's in my class. And so as we think about what kinds of things are helpful for teachers to know about a child's primary language, knowing that they can't know everything about all language, but what is it? And I feel like, Elsa, you were kind of getting there with understanding word order or syntax, for example, in a native language. So please continue.
Well, one of the foundations we know is that every language, English has practically the most phonemes of any language. So it has about 44 phonemes, some will say 46. Spanish has about 22, some will say 24, Arabic about 34, and these other languages. But here's the beauty about it. I don't have to know the language to know those connections to make. And there's a website called mylanguages.org. It'll have like 80, 90 languages. And I can get in there and say, what connects to the English language, right? And so right there, what a wonderful thing. I made a connection with that student. I made that connection at the level of, here are the sounds. What about the words in that structure? Okay, how does that work? The syntax in that language, and so that will help me also understand, it's because this is the structure that occurs there. So it's making those connections. I don't have to be a native speaker of that language. I don't have to be, but I can learn about structures, and I can learn about the potential stumbling blocks as they're learning English and getting on that journey towards literacy.
What might others add?
Yeah, someone put in the chat the link to my language, so that's very helpful.
Yeah. one of the things as we've talked about this integration and the knowledge that's necessary to really move our students forward, we've developed a program called SIPS, which is a phonological awareness, decoding program. And many of our folks who are on today, I'm seeing a lot of questions in particular about SIPS and as it relates to where we started around knowledge of the meaning of the word when we are working on decoding it. So one of the questions that's come up is, the words aren't organized around themes or like logical ways in which to organize the words. So how do we grapple with that when we're thinking about teaching the decoding of the English language and linking that to meaning? Linda, I don't know if you want to start us there.
Oh yeah, I'll take this one. Okay, so this is a kind of what I was trying to say, that when we're doing the explicit systematic phonics instruction, first of all, the words have to be organized the way they're organized, which is a combination of, they're basically focused on the sound spellings that are being taught. That's how phonics instruction works. They're not organized by themes. That is something that we would do elsewhere. On the other hand, you will know when you know your kids and you come to a word that you're sounding out and you're thinking, okay, these kids are not going to know what this word is, that you can so quickly just give a quick definition. Doesn't have to take a lot of time, because one of the things I worry about, and I've seen it, is where what should be a short, brisk phonics lesson turns into 1 hour, because now they're decoding, they're giving the meanings, they're having kids write them. I think it's important to stick with the way the program was designed. And then here's what you need to remember, and I'm just going to say this because I know SIPS very well, that SIPS is designed to do a certain thing, and it does it well. And that's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, sight words, okay? But a core curriculum, depending on the core curriculum, because there are some better or worse, is where you're dealing more with vocabulary. That doesn't mean you never deal with it while you're doing a SIPS lesson, because as I said, you might stop and do a quick point of use. You can stop and ask kids, do you know all these words? Is there a word you're not sure of? And I think we need to not mix up what we're doing when we're doing an explicit phonics decoding lesson with also doing vocabulary and language instruction.
Yeah, the birdwalk phenomenon is a constant. And I know, I mean, from having taught, I mean, we've all taught, and I know when I was teaching first grade, I mean, I would just, time would get the better of me. And you have to be very disciplined and what are we doing this for? What are we specifically engaged in here, but also know how it's going to fit in and integrate later on, and have the discipline, right? The professional discipline to stick to what you're teaching at the moment. As Linda says, you can give a quick definition. Some things are illustrated by actions very quickly, but don't get sidetracked. Don't go on a bird walk, because, time is of the essence.
I think that's really essential, because I think it goes back to what you've all been talking about all along, which is around intentionality.
Yeah.
What is the intention of the SIPS lesson, for example? How is that different than an intentional vocabulary lesson rather than incidental learning that we might decide to do in the moment? And I think that that's just such an important piece as we think about the varied needs. And I so appreciate you saying, Linda, when you know your kids, you know where they might stumble and what additional supports you might need to put in place all along the way.
Right. I mean, Marissa, if I could just throw, I mean, I don't want to start, bashing programs and so forth. That's one of the big problems with these, basal programs by so many publishers. They are so overloaded. They're so overstuffed. There are a lot of reasons for this: focus groups, one of the, mini masters, calling shots, blah, 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 blah. And the problem is that teachers are overloaded with things that either never get used, sometimes never get unshrink wrapped. And they're at a loss as to, how to prioritize things. And I mean, the textbook publishing industry in this country has has some serious issues and has created a lot of the log jams and bottlenecks that we see in teaching, particularly beginning literacy, but throughout the developmental sequence. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, someone asked about a program. Elsa's, we're going to put Elsa's in the book there in the.
So I do want to say something about that, Claude. You're absolutely right. I mean, I recall in one of our studies, I mean, it took 3 people at the PhD level to sit for 5 days to figure out from all the stuff what would be most important from all this stuff for that classroom. And imagine how overwhelmed the classroom teacher is when, okay, this is all you're supposed to do and you get all this stuff. But that really just points to Claude and Linda work, university level and working to, help teachers to prepare, but nothing takes the place of a well-informed and expert teacher.
Right.
And that teacher who really understands students, who understands the learning, who understands about literacy, who understands, now we're talking about, multi-literacy. There's so much that you have to know. And if we could do more work in our teacher preparation programs, it will help that educator to really make good decisions. But as Linda has said, that and Claude mentioned this, you do need some general principles. And I think you do need something initially to follow to get, and you need that training to know what to do. And I wish districts didn't have to pay so much money to get all this extra professional development. I wish in the 4 years that they were at a university that they could learn this. And by the way, we shouldn't just be teaching about, we're only going to be teaching here about, English literacy. We should be teaching about the diverse populations that we're going to serve and what this means. And as we look across this country with more than 5 million of these students, and there really is no excuse. Every teacher needs to be a language literacy teacher and prepared to work with an English learner.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just said that. It's so important. I do want to say something I'm seeing in the chat. When you're doing phonics lessons, it should be real words, not nonsense words. I have seen, and I see this in the chat, that some programs use nonsense words for their phonics lessons. Nonsense words are helpful in assessment. When you think of a nonsense word, fluency measure, Ames, Webb, Dibbles, FAST, etc., and certainly as part of research. But my goodness, we don't have enough time to get these kids up to speed as it is without using phonics, nonsense words to teach decoding. No way should we be doing that. And, I'm sorry for seeing that that's happening. There was also a question, again, this is because I know SIPS so well. SIPS is being used in 2 school districts in California that have a high proportion of English learners. And what they're seeing is it's working beautifully for them. And what they're also doing is making sure that they are also teaching vocabulary and language, not right at the same moment, but that they have a comprehensive approach. And the other thing, one of the districts, I wish I knew the name, has a Spanish phonics curriculum that they're using in their dual language program. And I can't remember the name of it. The school district is Pajaro Valley, P-A-R-A-J-O, in Watsonville, California. And they have a very explicit systematic phonics curriculum in their dual language program, but they're taking the SIPS routines and applying the routines to their phonics program, which is making a very nice, also another connection. and they're seeing really good results. Bonita Unified in California also has a large English learner population. So I don't make money on SIPs. I just want to say that, but I know that it works.
You know what I so appreciate? I mean, we can say the nonsense word stuff louder for the folks in the back. I think we'll just keep saying that over and over again around its need for assessment. I want to carry us back to something Claude and Elsa really brought forward, which is around the relationship between the professional learning that is necessary that a teacher has and where that meets a program. And, you know, Dr. Moats, we've already invoked her once here today. I'll bring her back again, talks so much about we can build the teacher knowledge, but teachers cannot enact all of that knowledge and drive it from the ground up. They have to be able to have programs that are supportive of them. However, a program in and of itself is not a replacement for the depth of learning that we know a teacher needs. So as we kind of come closer to the end of our time together, I'd love for us to just share what's a really important takeaway from our discussion today, that if a teacher's here with us today, what's the one nugget he or she really is taking forward from this discussion? So Claude, will you kick us off on that one?
Yeah, I guess it was my turn eventually to start off. Yeah, well, I mean, I think the most fundamental thing that I would like people to walk away with is that, you know, what we know from reading research, whether you call it science of reading or whatever you call it, what we know from that for kids in general is also applicable and foundational for English language learners. But you've got to be mindful of providing that extra support in the language so that they understand the words and the text that they are being taught to read. I mean, they're not only reading words to learn the words, but they're reading words to learn to read, right? They serve a dual purpose. And so you've got to provide that support. Now, the same principle is true as they go up the grades, but it gets more complicated because the vocabulary, the language, the background knowledge, the expectations for reading and reading comprehension grow exponentially. But the principle is the same. What's effective instruction in literacy in general is effective for English learners, but that language support is so important and it becomes very complex. And we don't really have, from my perspective, good instructional models that actually will help close the gap. We have instructional models that'll help the kids grow, ELs and non-ELs, but the gap grows larger and larger as the language discrepancies get bigger and bigger. And that's right on the frontiers of where we need to work as researchers, as practitioners, as clinicians, and as collaborators to try to help close that gap, because we're pretty good. We can close the gap early on, pretty much to a large extent, but it gets more challenging the higher up they go. But don't leave that foundational knowledge aside. Don't assume that because, you know, we haven't done a million studies with ELs, which we haven't done, it's not applicable to ELs, because it is applicable to ELs, but it requires more from the kids and from the teachers.
And I'd like to follow up on that. I think my takeaway today is every teacher is a language and literacy teacher. And that also means if you're in science classroom, math, social studies, language arts, you know, throughout the day, because there are opportunities and students need, and especially these English learners, you're expecting them to read, you know, the textbooks that address these subjects. But unless they have those capabilities and that vocabulary and that knowledge of how the language works, they're not going to be able to read it and write about it. But the other things is that teachers, as we think about it, have those, you know, really think about the skills that you need and how you can integrate those skills throughout that day, that we can be working, addressing in an intentional, authentic way, language and literacy. And I do want to say at the University of Houston, there is the Center for the Success of English Learners, which is now a new initiative. And we don't have, you know, enough work on those long-term English learners or on those adolescent English learners. And so some of the work has been done, and now it's just getting started and continuing scaling it up. And I think, you know, at ccellcentered.org, just beginning, and once this gets out, we're going to know so much more. But the United States is really supporting, English learners and these big studies to really try and figure out what should we do. And I saw some questions there about the long-term English learners. But first, we have to see what were the gaps, and did we cause those gaps? In one study, we were there for 5 years in a school district, and they changed 3 times their language of instruction model. That creates gaps. And so if we don't implement and look at the model to see what we're doing and how it's working, and we just keep changing, we're creating gaps in educational programming. And maybe the students came in with gaps, but we also need to make sure, how do we fill in those gaps, and are we creating any gaps? So language supports reading, and reading supports language.
I'd like to just add for both that preparation programs for pre-service teachers, those programs are woefully inadequate. We think they're inadequate around just understanding reading, but they're even more problematic when it comes to helping budding teacher candidates how to teach kids who are English learners. And I think that's an area that is really deserving of major attention.
I think one of the things I'm really taking away also from this conversation is the notions around an asset-based mindset and framework versus a deficit-based mindset and framework. And as we think about the student's first language as an asset to be built on, to be learned from, rather than when we hear comments like, they're in 3rd grade and they still have no language skills. They have a lot of language skills, they just might not have English language skills. And so how do we really frame that and support our teachers in that way? Yeah. One other thing that's just come up in a couple of places here in both the Q&A and the chat is, again, thinking about the oral language that's necessary in order to start connecting. So someone asked, there's been a notion to them that reading instruction should not start until their oral language has been developed. So I love them unison shaking heads.
Me too.
We just share, right? We share a little bit about why that thinking is flawed, and how do we give each other the language to kind of engage in that kind of conversation.
Elsa, you go.
Remember what my takeaway was? Language supports reading, reading supports language. I mean, once again, are we going to work in a silo? We are all, so as we are developing language, what really helps us is to understand the structure of that language. And as we begin to understand that structure, fantastic, because that supports what we're doing. You hear a lot of even, adult English learners say, how I learned English? I started looking and reading, and I was looking for the cognates, the words that were similar across the languages. I was also looking for the morphemes, those word parts that transferred, and they were looking similar, and I was making these connections, right? So having and working on language, we do not have to delay reading instruction until language is developed. No, that's, again, it's not sequential, it's simultaneous.
So I want to put in the chat 2 citations to 2 studies I think are just foundational. One by Sharon Vaughn and her colleagues. I think Elsa was one of the culprits, one of the perps in that study. And then Linnea Airy and her colleagues. I'm going to put it in the chat right now. And it provides, it's not a curriculum, right? I mean, go to Elsa's curriculum for that, but it provides a beautiful model in a very nicely described research context of how to integrate the language support aspects of early reading instruction. And these are 2 studies with 1st grade language minority Spanish speaking kids who are having difficulty. They weren't yet having reading, they were at risk for reading difficulties, they had reading difficulties, and very explicitly, and read the description of what the researchers actually did, what the intervention consisted of. And you'll see that they took a previously effective program for monolingual English speakers, And then added to that, layered on, integrated into that language support to help the kids understand the words and the language and the text that they were being taught to read. Now, Sharon's study was the only one of several reviewed, by the IES that actually had significant effects on reading. The other interventions that were reviewed had effects on phonological awareness, letter sounds, blah, 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 which, okay, is important. But Sharon's study is the only one who actually had an impact on reading, which is not trivial. And then Linnea Airy's study came sometime afterwards, and it has the same basic idea. So I would really encourage people, particularly if you're in a professional learning community or people are interested in reading research, to take a look at these studies and say, what did they do? How did the instruction provided to these at-risk language minority kids, how is it similar to, and how did it differ from an effective program for monolingual English speakers learning to read? I think it'll be tremendously informative to get it from that angle. And then, of course, get Elsa's program.
Yeah, well, no, well, we actually created from that, we called it Proactive and Proactiva, but what really was different is taking what was already out there and really putting in that's, those intentional oral language opportunities related to what we were going to be doing in that phonics. And by the way, those studies, we did those over a 10-year period. I mean, Claude was involved in the first 5 years, and then we scaled up another 5 years. And so it was a good 10 years, but already building upon effective work that was already done. It was just adding to that work,
Right.
Adding to that oral language, and really looking at, the opportunities for vocabulary, for listening, speaking, reading, and writing while you're working in very, very, purposefully on helping them to improve those reading skills. And he's right. We got great results in reading, and the oral language proficiency, it went up. It wasn't these great statistical significant, but we started from the bottom, right? And so, I think more work needs to be done in that area as well. But some of those are also written up, and I think they're in some of those IES practice guides.
I think this really brings us full circle, really, to the title of our time together today, which is really where the science meets the learner. And I am so grateful that the conversation really was surrounded by all the aspects that the science tells us is important. And I think, as the conversation sometimes can get really hyper-focused on one aspect of Dr. Scarborough's route, for example, we've really come to our time together today to think about the intentional integration of all of those aspects in order to really build a reader. So, friends, this has been time flew by, which is unbelievable that here we are really close to the end of our time. We have about 9 million questions in the chat and in the Q&A. But I tell you what we will do, many of the resources that all of us has shared today, we will add to the follow-up email that you'll get with the recording of this, including the citations to both of the studies that Claude just mentioned, as well as Elsa's book and all the other pieces. I know folks, right, when Linda got talking to, people were like, what's the name of that book again? Don't worry, we're going to tell you. We'll make sure that we have all of that in our follow-up email to you, which will also include the chat. So you'll be able to go back and follow this conversation. And I want to share one more resource with you, given that we just had that little nugget of conversation around nonsense words and their importance in assessment. I want to invite you to join us next month when we really are going to delve deeply into reading assessment and understanding what assessments for what purposes, why are we doing what we're doing? Even going back to, I think the first thing you talked about, Elsa, was really understanding where our students are and understanding that assessment. So I want to really encourage you to join us on February 24th. Dr. Jan Hasbrook and Dr. Michelle Hosp will be leading that work with us. And I can't say enough about them as colleagues and how much we all are going to learn from them. So with that, I am going to say thank you very much for spending 54 minutes of your day with us today. And those of you who are teaching, I am so grateful to you for the work that you do each and every day, especially in the climate and environment you're working in right now. We're so grateful that you spent some time with us today as well, given your busy schedules. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Elsa. Thank you, Claude.
Thank
It
you,
was
Marissa. Did a great
joy.
job.
Thank
It was
you
Thank
for
you.
It was a pleasure.
organizing us.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And it was so nice to join your friend group for the hour. And
Welcome, welcome.
I can't wait. I can't wait. So thank you all so very much, and take care, everyone.